Some locks don't just keep strangers out. They bury decades of family secrets and act as a final resting place for broken relationships. I stood in the freezing mountain air of Neelum Valley, watching my daughter-in-law's arrogant parents shove their designer clothes into cheap plastic trash bags, weeping in the dark. They thought because I was a quiet, 65-year-old widow, they could steal my late husband's legacy, call me a dying, middle-class old bag, and take over my life. But they forgot one thing. The most dangerous monster in the room is always the one who stays completely silent. If you have ever been underestimated, taken for granted, or pushed to your absolute limit by entitled people who thought you were too weak to fight back, hit that like button, subscribe and lock in. Because today's story is a masterclass in why you should never confuse a mother's silence with submission. Let's get into it. My name is Samina. I am 65 years old. To look at me is to see a woman who has lived a life defined by quiet dedication. For over 35 years, I worked as a government school teacher, managing a meager salary, counting pennies, and sacrificing every luxury so my only son, Daniel, would never know what it felt like to go without. When my husband, the love of my life, passed away 5 years ago, a piece of my soul left with him. But before he closed his eyes for the last time, he placed his calloused hand over mine and whispered, "Samina, build the cottage. The one we always talked about. Go to the mountains. Find your peace." And so, I did. I took every single rupee of my retirement fund, my life savings, and the small pension my husband left behind. I bought a small, secluded plot of land in the breathtaking, mist-covered heights of Neelum Valley. It was a beautiful wooden cottage, surrounded by towering pine trees, where the air smelled of fresh pine needles, and the only sound was the distant rush of the river. It wasn't just a house. It was my sanctuary. It was my late husband's final embrace. Because I was still settling things in the main city, I kept the cottage locked, saving it for the day I would permanently retire. I visited it rarely, but in my mind, it was my safe haven. To protect my most sacred memories, I had hidden a small velvet box inside the bedroom closet. Inside it was a heavy, intricately crafted gold heritage necklace, the only heirloom left to me by my late mother. It was supposed to be a symbol of love, passed down through generations. Instead, it became the catalyst for a nightmare. It was a chilly Friday afternoon when I decided to drive up to Neelum Valley unannounced to spend a quiet weekend. The drive up the winding mountain roads usually filled my heart with peace, but that day, a strange, suffocating anxiety gripped my chest. When my car pulled up the gravel driveway, my heart skipped a beat. Tire tracks cut deep into the mud. The front porch light, which should have been off, was burning brightly in the broad daylight. My hands trembled as I took the heavy iron key out of my purse. I slipped it into the ancient rusted padlock on the front door. I turned it. Click. But as the heavy wooden doors swung open, the air that greeted me wasn't a scent of fresh pine or the clean, crisp breeze of the mountains. It smelled of heavy cigar smoke, stale, expensive perfume, and cheap grease. And then, I heard it. It wasn't the sound of laughter. It was the sharp, unmistakable sound of delicate metal snapping apart, followed by a heavy object hitting the wooden floorboards upstairs. A cold dread washed over me. I dropped my bags and rushed toward the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I bypassed the stairs and stepped into the main living room first, and what I saw froze the blood in my veins. Sitting on my custom-built, hand-carved velvet sofa, the very sofa my late husband and I designed together, were Tariq and Shamila, the parents of my daughter-in-law, Aliyah. They weren't just visiting. They had moved in. The living room was completely unrecognizable. Half-eaten plates of oily food were rotting on the coffee table. Empty soda cans left ugly rings on the polished wood. Spilled tea stained the carpet. Sitting on the adjacent chairs were distant relatives of theirs, people I had never seen in my life, laughing loudly, their muddy boots resting carelessly on my handmade footstools. Tariq, a large, arrogant man who ran a failing textile business and masked his financial insecurity with loud bragging, was leaning back, a thick cigar clamped between his teeth. In his right hand, he held a delicate porcelain teacup, a piece of a limited edition, set my husband bought me for our silver anniversary. I stood in the shadow of the doorway, completely invisible to them as they carried on their conversation. Tariq, are you sure we won't get caught? Samina asked, her voice dripping with artificial worry as she adjusted her expensive silk shawl. What if that old woman decides to come up here for the weekend? Tariq let out a booming, condescending laugh, blowing a thick cloud of grey smoke into the pristine air of my living room. He tapped his cigar, letting the hot ash fall directly onto the armrest of my velvet sofa. Caught by who, Samina? Tariq sneered, taking a slow sip from my anniversary cup. Don't make me laugh, Samina. Feel free to enjoy yourself. Look around. This place is paradise. And don't worry about that middle-class old bag. She's got one foot in the grave anyway. With her health, she'd probably drop dead in the next few years. Once she's gone, this entire property automatically belongs to our daughter, Alia and Danielle. And since Danielle does whatever Alia tells him to do, this house is basically ours. We are just taking our inheritance a little early. The world around me seemed to spin. The air left my lungs. The most horrifying scream is the one that never leaves your throat, the one that turns inward, transforming into a raging, burning storm inside your chest. A middle-class old bag. 1 foot in the grave. Our inheritance. These were the people I had welcomed into my home with open arms when my son married their daughter. I had given them respect, humility and grace, assuming their wealthy exterior matched their character. But beneath the silk and the cigars, they were nothing but vultures, waiting for my corpse to rot so they could pick up my bones. Just then, Samina turned her head and caught sight of me standing in the doorway. For a fraction of a second, just a microscopic blink of an eye, I looked for a flicker of shame on her face, a blush of embarrassment, a stuttered apology. There was none. Instead, Samina simply rolled her eyes, reached over to casually straighten a cushion on my ruined sofa, and spoke to me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into her backyard. "Oh, Samina? You're here?" she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Alia told us this house was just sitting here, completely useless and rotting away in the mountains. So, we thought we'd do you a favor and spend a few days here to keep the place alive. Besides, eventually, all of this is going to be our daughter's anyway, right? You should have called before coming. We don't have enough food prepped for you." If they expected me to scream, they were mistaken. If they expected me to burst into tears and beg them to leave, they didn't know the woman standing before them. When you realize that the people destroying your life have absolutely no conscience, your anger evaporates. It turns into something far more dangerous. Pure, ice-cold clarity. I didn't utter a single word. I didn't yell. I didn't demand they get off my furniture. I turned on my heel and walked calmly into the kitchen. The sink was piled high with crusty, moldy dishes. My expensive spices were scattered everywhere. I stood by the kitchen counter, my hands steady, and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my banking application. You see, my son Daniel had recently approached me with a grand business proposal. He wanted to launch a new logistics startup, and because I loved him blindly, I had agreed to be his primary investor. I had opened a joint business account and deposited 80 lakh rupees, $800,000 PKR, literally the remaining bulk of my life's security, into that account. The deal for his new project was supposed to be finalized the following week. As I stared at the digital screen, the realization of what had happened hit me like a physical blow. Daniel knew what this cottage meant to me. He knew his father built it with his bare hands. And yet he had given the keys to his wife, who had handed them to her parasitic parents. He had traded my sanctuary, my husband's memory, and my dignity just to keep his entitled wife happy. He had rendered himself utterly helpless in front of her greed. The deepest wounds are always inflicted by the ones you loved more than your own soul. With a single, deliberate tap of my finger, I initiated a wire transfer. I moved every single rupee, all 80 lakhs, out of that joint account and back into my private, locked savings account. It wasn't theft. It was the immediate termination of a trust that had been violated. It was the end of a mother's blind, enabling love. I walked out of the kitchen, past the living room without acknowledging a single person, walked out the front door, got into my car, and drove back down the mountain. As I navigated the dark, treacherous curves of the highway in the dead of night, tears did not fall from my eyes. What was washing out of me was the blinding, foolish affection I had carried for a son who didn't respect his father's memory or his mother's survival. Some decisions are so incredibly quiet that the enemy doesn't even hear the fuse burning until the bomb explodes their entire world. The explosion happened at precisely 9 a.m. the next morning. The front door of my city apartment was practically kicked open. Alia, my daughter-in-law, stormed into my living room like a Category 5 hurricane. Her face was deformed with rage, her skin mottled and blue with fury. She didn't greet me. She didn't show an ounce of manners. Samina Biogram. What on earth is wrong with you? Alia shrieked, slamming her designer handbag onto my dining table. My mother called me crying hysterically. She said you walked into the Neelum Valley cottage last night, stood there like a ghost, and insulted them by refusing to even speak to them before storming out. Who do you think you are to humiliate my parents like that? Just because your name is on the deed doesn't mean we are outsiders. That house belongs to this family. I was sitting in my armchair, quietly sipping a hot cup of tea. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely unbothered. I carefully set the porcelain cup down onto its saucer. The soft clink echoed loudly in the silent room. I leaned forward, looking directly into Alia's venomous eyes. For the first time in her life, she didn't see the timid, accommodating old mother-in-law. She saw a wall of solid stone. Alia, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm whisper. That house belongs to me. Your parents are not uninvited guests. They are illegal squatters who broke into my sanctuary, defiled my late husband's furniture, and trashed my property. They have until Sunday night to pack their bags and get out. If they are not gone by then, there will be consequences. When you grant people too much leniency, they begin to mistake your grace for weakness. Alia let out a sharp, mocking laugh, tossing her hair back with utter disdain. Oh, really? And what if they don't leave, huh? What are you going to do? Call the cops on your own son's family? Good luck with the embarrassment. Alia sneered, leaning over the table, her eyes narrowing. And while we are on the topic of crazy behavior, Daniel just checked the business account. The 80 lakh rupees are gone. Where is the money, Samina? The contract signing for our new project is next week. If we don't have that capital, the entire deal falls through and we lose everything. Put the money back right now. I looked at her, a cold, humorless smile touching my lips. The money went exactly where respect lives, Alia, I said, my voice cutting through her rage like a scalpel. Since you and your husband decided to turn my sacred cottage into a free holiday resort for your classless relatives, I have decided to permanently withdraw my financial support. Consider your investment gone. Alia gasped, her face draining of color. You can't do that. That's Daniel's future. I can, and I did, I replied, standing up to face her. And listen to me very carefully. If your parents are not out of that cottage by Sunday night at precisely 8 p.m. on Monday morning, they will be sitting on the dirt roads of Neelum Valley. I have already submitted an emergency request to the utility companies. The electricity and water lines to that cottage will be completely cut off at 8:01 p.m. Let's see how much your arrogant father enjoys his cigars in a freezing, pitch-black house with no water. Alia stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She realized, for the very first time, that the middle-class old bag had teeth. Darkness isn't just the absence of light. Sometimes it is the beautiful, terrifying dawn of an arrogant person's downfall. On Sunday evening, the mountain air of Neelum Valley was biting cold. At exactly 7:45 p.m., I pulled up to the cottage. But I wasn't alone. In the passenger seat was a professional locksmith, and sitting in the back were two massive, uniformed private security guards I had hired from the city. Inside the cottage, the lights were blazing. Loud, obnoxious music was blaring through the windows. Through the glass, I could see Tariq sitting by the fireplace, irresponsibly smoking another cigar, totally convinced that my threat was an empty bluff. They thought an old woman would never have the courage to face them. I checked my watch. 7:59 p.m., 8 p.m., right on cue. The entire cottage plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The music died instantly. The warmth of the electric heaters vanished, replaced immediately by the creeping, sub-zero mountain chill. From inside the house, screams of confusion and panic erupted. I stepped out of the car. Escorted by the two large security guards and the locksmith, I walked up the porch steps and pushed the front door open. Tariq was stumbling around in the dark, holding the flashlight of his phone, his face pale and sweating despite the cold. When the beam of his flashlight hit my face, his breath caught in his throat. The cigar slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the floor. "Samina, what is the meaning of this?" Tariq stammered, his voice losing all of its former bravado. "The power went out. It's freezing. Tell your guards to back off." I stepped into the room, my face expressionless. I raised my wrist, illuminated by the security guard's heavy tactical flashlight, and looked at my watch. "Tariq Sahab," I said, my voice echoing like ice cracking in winter. "It is currently 8:01 p.m. You have exactly 19 minutes to throw whatever belongings you can carry into the trunk of your car. At 8:20 p.m., my locksmith is changing every single lock on this house. Whatever property is left inside after 20 minutes will either become mine, or I will pile it in the driveway and set it on fire to keep myself warm. Your time starts now. You're insane. You can't do this to us." Shamila shrieked from the dark, wrapping her expensive shawl tighter around herself, as the mountain cold began to seep into her bones. "We are your family. My family died when you called me a middle-class old bag and waited for me to die in my own living room." I snapped back. 16 minutes left. What followed was the most deeply satisfying spectacle I have ever witnessed in my 65 years on this earth. When resources and relationships are built entirely on greed, the moment things get tough, the facade crumbles. There was no dignity left in them. Tariq and Shamila, the proud, wealthy, arrogant elite, were literally reduced to tears. In the freezing, pitch-black night, illuminated only by the headlights of my car, they were scrambling around the house, frantically stuffing their designer clothes, unwashed underwear, and expensive shoes into black plastic garbage bags. Shamila was weeping openly, her expensive makeup running down her face as she slipped on the icy porch. Tariq's hands were shaking so violently he couldn't even get his car keys into the ignition on the first try. They were frantically calling Danielle on their cell phones, screaming into the receiver, "Your mother has gone completely insane. She's kicking us out into the wilderness. She's a monster." But Danielle couldn't help them. Danielle had no power here. At exactly 8:20 p.m., the locksmith clicked the final, heavy-duty deadbolt into place on the front door, The cottage was entirely sealed. I walked over to the main electrical breaker on the porch and switched off the master exterior light. I stood there in the quiet serenity of the mountains, watching their car speed away down the dark, winding roads, their garbage bags tied loosely to the roof. I unlocked my door, stepped inside my clean, quiet sanctuary, closed the door behind me, and finally, breathed in the scent of the pine trees. Peace had returned. 2 days later, Daniel came to see me at my city apartment. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands were shaking, and he looked completely broken. He fell to his knees crying, telling me that because I withdrew the 80 lakh rupees, his business partnership had collapsed. His reputation was ruined, and Aliyah was threatening to divorce him and leave. I placed a gentle hand on his head. I told him, "Son, she won't leave you, because she knows your mother still holds the keys to everything she actually desires. But from this day forward, the rules are mine. If Aliyah wants to remain in this family, she will submit a written, signed apology to me, and the deeds to every single piece of property will remain solely under my name for the next 10 years. They both learned a lesson they will never forget. Never mistake a person's silence for lack of power. Sometimes, to save your self-respect, you have to put a lock on certain relationships. I am Samina. I am free. And this is my ultimate victory. If Samina's ice-cold revenge gave you absolute chills and satisfied your inner sense of justice, smash that like button right now. Let me know in the comments below. What would you have done if you found your in-laws disrespecting your late spouse's memory like that? Don't forget to subscribe for more of the most thrilling, satisfying revenge stories on the internet. See you in the next one.